Hi, welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight, I'll be featuring the case of Diane Downs. This was a recommendation by friend of the show, Dancing Firefly. So thank you, Dancing Firefly, for the recommendation. Now, let's go ahead and find out more. Let's go ahead and dive on in. Elizabeth Diane Fredrickson was born on August 7, 1955. Her parents were Wes and Willadine Fredrickson. She grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. Diane's childhood is one of conflicting reports. She alleges that when she was a child, her father molested her. Nonetheless, she graduated from Moon Valley High School in Phoenix. It is here where she met Steve Downs. After high school, Diane attended Pacific Coast Baptist College in Orange, California. It was a Bible school. But she didn't stay there very long. After only a year, she was expelled for promiscuity. November 13th, 1973, Diane and Steve Downs were married. 1974, the couple welcomed their first child, daughter Christy Allen. 1976, the couple welcomed their second child, daughter Cheryl Lynn. 1979, the couple welcomed a third child, son Stephen Danny. By 1980, however, Diane and Steve divorced. Diane worked for the United States Postal Service. She had assigned mail routes in the city of Cottage Grove, Oregon. Those who knew Diane, friends, neighbors, acquaintances, all stated that Diane was an unfit parent. She put everything else before her children. May 19th, 1983, according to Diane, she and her children had eaten a fast dinner at home, then left to visit her friend Heather. Heather had told Diane a few days earlier she was thinking about buying a horse. Diane found an ad in the newspaper about horse rentals, and she thought her friend Heather might be interested in seeing the ad. Well, Diane didn't know Heather's phone number. They weren't that close of friends, so Diane decided to bring the advertisement to her herself. The drive would be a good opportunity to get the kids out of the house for a couple hours. So they went to Heather's. On the way home, Diane thought it might be fun to take the children sightseeing. Diane then claims she was driving in a rural street when she saw a man in the middle of the street, so she stopped the car to get out to see if he needed assistance. He then demanded the keys to her car, and when she refused, he leaned into her car and shot her 3 children. Then he turned the gun on her and shot her in the arm. Diane pretended to throw the keys, and then she jumped in her car and drove to the hospital. When she arrived at Mackenzie Willamette Hospital, the car had blood splattered all over the inside of the car, but there was no blood on Diane. Quote, "Somebody just shot my kids," end quote, she said as she pulled up to the hospital with her 3 children, Christy Downs, 8 years old, Cheryl Ann Downs, 7 years old, and Danny Downs, 3 years old. Hospital staff were immediately taken aback by Diane's demeanor. A nurse, Rose Martin, recalled Diane's peculiar attitude toward what just happened. Quote, "She asked how her children were, and I told her the doctors were in there working on them. And then the mother, laughed and said, 'Only the best for my kids.' And then she laughed again and said, 'Well, I have good insurance,'" end quote. Dr. John Mackey, who was in charge of the ER that evening, described the children's chest wounds and the medical team's first spontaneous efforts of life-saving. His observation of Diane was, quote, "She was extremely composed. She was unbelievably composed. I couldn't believe she was a family member. There were no tears, no disbelief, no, 'Why did this happen to me?' End quote." X-ray technician Carlene Elbridge could not get over the fact that Diane, a mother of 3 severely wounded youngsters, complained about having to be seen in public without makeup. When Diane was given the terrible news that her middle child, Cheryl, had died and that Christy and Danny were fatally injured, she took the news with grace. Her reaction stunned the hospital personnel, who had expected her to be hysterical, screaming, crying, angry. Nothing. She was too accepting. In addition, shortly upon arriving at the hospital, Diane called a man, Robert Knickerbocker, a married man and a former colleague in Arizona, in whom she'd been having an affair with. She made this phone call before she knew the status of her own children and before alerting her ex-husband, who was the father of the children. So, who is Robert Knickerbocker? Robert was a postal worker in Chandler. He was married, but started having an affair with Diane. He didn't expect the affair to last long, but as the months rolled on, he found that she was not intending to let it go. In fact, she was pulling on his private time and urging him to divorce his wife as soon as possible. Robert tried to see her less, but each time Diane protested violently. Quote, "The affair continued and continued, and I was with Diane all day at work, and I'd be with her all night long, and it was every day for months. I basically didn't have time to think, I was with Diane all the time," end quote. He was very adamant, however, that he didn't want children, and just didn't want children in his life, period. Diane would repeatedly try to tell him the children wouldn't be a bother to him. He finally decided to end things with Diane. Quote, "Diane asked me who I loved most, her or my wife. I said I loved my wife. She blew up. She ranted and raved and screamed at me. I'd never seen anybody act that way before," end quote. So Robert was surprised when he received a phone call from Diane the night of the shooting. Now, several nurses and an investigator were bedside with Diane when they were finally allowed to go into the intensive care unit to see daughter Christy. Christy had suffered a stroke and she was unable to speak. They noted as Diane squeezed her daughter's hand and said, "I love you," it was devoid of warmth as a mother. It was almost like ice. Her words passed through clenched teeth. Alton, who was an investigator, noticed something else, that Christy's eyes, peeking from above the oxygen mask, took on a glazed look of fear when she spotted her mother approaching. Alton said, quote, "I happened to glance at the heart rate monitor, the pulse, when Diane came in. The scope showed Christy's heart was beating 104 times a minute, but when Diane took hold of her, that scope jumped to 147, end quote. When detectives reviewed the forensic evidence, it did not match Diane's statement of events. There was no blood on the driver's side of the car, no gunpowder residue on the driver's panel. When Diane was asked by police if she had a gun, she told them she didn't. However, Steve Downs and Robert Knickerbocker told police Diane did in fact own a .22 caliber handgun. Investigators later discovered that although they were unable to find the actual weapon, they found unfired casings in her home with extractor markings from the same gun that shot the children. Witnesses came forward from the night of the shooting. They said they saw Diane's car driving towards the hospital, but it was driving extremely slow at an estimated speed of 5 to 7 miles an hour. This directly contradicts Diane's statement that she drove to the hospital at a high speed after the shooting. May 25th, 2013, Cheryl Downs' funeral was held with bereavement from family, intimate friends, and it was in Springfield community. This same week, Christy and Danny were making huge miracles in their recovery. One of Christy's arms was paralyzed and her speech was garbled, but doctors believed she would be capable of being revitalized. Danny, sadly, would probably be crippled the rest of his life, but his brain, thankfully, had not been affected. Police had gone through Diane's diaries and believed now, more than ever, that she was guilty. They reeked of a longing for Robert, her lost love, a man who, by the tone of her diary pages, had deserted her. The cause of his desertion may have been, and the diary hinted this, that his wife had simply stepped in and put the clamps down. Police now interviewed Robert Knickerbocker. He insisted that his wife be there at his side during this interview while he discussed everything with police. His wife, he said, knew the history and had forgiven him. The couple had reconciled, and he wanted nothing more to do with Diane Downs. Despite Diane's pleas, Robert refused to see her when she was with Danny, Christy, and Cheryl. Quote, "I wouldn't be with her if the children were around. It was an affair. It didn't seem right." End quote. February 28th, 1984. Diane was arrested and charged with murder and 2 counts of each attempted murder and criminal assault. Diane was already pregnant now with her 4th child. So she told a reporter, quote, "I got pregnant because I miss Christy and I miss Danny and I miss Cheryl so much. You can't replace children, but you can replace the effect that they give you. And they give me love. They give me satisfaction. They give me stability. They give me a reason to live and a reason to be happy." End quote. During her trial, prosecutors argued Diane shot her children to be free of them so she could continue her affair with Robert Knickerbocker. This was because he made it known that he did not want children in his life. The climax of the trial was when daughter Christy Downs testified against her mother. Once she recovered her ability to speak, she described how her mother shot all 3 of them while parked at the side of the road and then shot herself in the arm. Quote, "She leaned over to the back seat and shot Danny." End quote. "What happened then?" said the prosecutor. "What happened after Danny got shot? Do you remember when you got shot?" "Yes." "Who shot you?" Quote, "My mom." End quote. Psychiatrists diagnosed Diane with narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders. The night of the shooting and during the shooting, on the radio, "Hungry Like the Wolf" was playing. When that song was purposely played for in court by the prosecutors, Diane started tapping her foot and moving her head to the music. That song reminded her of Robert Knickerbocker. June 17th, 1984. Diane was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison, plus 50 years. The judge made it clear that he did not wish Diane to ever regain her freedom. Diane showed little to no emotion as the verdict was read. 10 days before her sentencing, Diane gave birth to the baby, and the baby was seized by the state of Oregon and adopted out soon after. July 11th, 1987, Diane escaped from the Oregon's Women's Correctional Center of Oregon. Authorities say she scaled 2 18-foot fences surrounding the prison, climbed under a pickup truck, and waited several minutes before calmly walking away. Prison officials later said they believed Diane wore several layers of clothing to avoid puncture wounds from the barbed wire at the top of the fences. July 21st, 1987. Diane was captured in Salem, Oregon. She received a 5-year sentence for the escape. Diane has come up for parole on several occasions, and each time, she's been denied. The surviving children eventually went to live with one of the prosecutors of the case, Fred Hughey. He and his wife, Joanne, adopted them in 1994. Fred, as I said, was one of the prosecutors in the case. He knew Danny would be confined to a wheelchair, but described him as still being a happy boy, and Christy had grown into a very content teenager. That is the case of Diane Downs. Thank you for sticking around for another episode of Danny After Dark, and thank you, Dancing Firefly, for the case suggestion. Do you have any comments or questions about the case? Leave it down below and let's be interactive. Do you have a suggestion for a case that you'd like me to cover? Well, leave it down below. You may see it featured in an upcoming episode. Until next time, remember, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us.